Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The very first sentence in section 1 of David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding begins with the words moral philosophy, and he immediately says, or the science of human nature, and then he's going to talk about two different ways in which it can be treated, which we've talked about elsewhere. And we should pause for a moment on this term moral philosophy, right? Because like many terms in philosophy, we could call them metaphilosophical terms because they're talking about philosophy from within philosophy, it's going to have multiple meanings. And it's important at the start, if you're going to read Hume and understand him, to not confuse what he's calling moral philosophy with what somebody else might have called moral philosophy, which is often sort of a synonym for ethics, a particular field of philosophy, which not everybody agrees about exactly what it includes and how far it goes. We can say this: it's not just about determining good and bad, right or wrong, or giving people rules by which they can do the right thing and avoid doing the wrong thing. That would be a very, very narrow conception of moral philosophy. Instead, for Hume, it encompasses quite a lot, as we're going to see, and some of it is what we would nowadays call psychology or moral psychology, anthropology, philosophical anthropology, study of human nature. It's looking into our motivations. Now, it does, of course, have to do with virtue and vice, goodness and badness, and all sorts of other things, but it also has to do with our emotions and our drives and the practical reasoning that we engage in and human capacities for understanding things and how they're different from other capacities that we have. So if we want to know what he's actually going to mean by moral philosophy throughout this treatise, I think we want to move on to fairly close to the end of this section. After he's given his pleading or defense for metaphysics, as it turns out, what he's calling metaphysics has a significant overlap with what he's calling moral philosophy. A lot of metaphysics is just the abstruse kind of moral philosophy. But he ends up saying that we need to engage in accurate scrutiny into the powers and faculties of human nature. And he goes on and he says, it's remarkable concerning the operations of the mind that though they're most intimately present to us, because we have minds, right? Whenever they become the object of reflection, they seem involved in obscurity. Nor can the eye readily find those lines and boundaries which discriminate and distinguish them. The objects are too fine to remain long in the same aspect or situation and must be apprehended in an instant by a superior penetration derived from nature and improved by habit and reflection. So that is part of what we're doing in engaging in moral philosophy. We are going to be ordering and distinguishing. And this is quite important. So distinguishing, telling things apart from each other. He'll actually give you some examples a little bit later on, saying there are many obvious distinctions of this kind, such as between the will, the faculty that chooses things or commits to things, and the understanding. These are two distinct faculties. They're not the same thing. Or imagination and passions, right? And he says these fall within the comprehension of every human creature. So there, at least in the broad sense, a lot of this distinguishing is done by us as we look at our own faculties, as our culture teaches us about them. So distinguishing is very important. And then there's ordering. How are these arranged in relation to each other? How should they be arranged if we want to make good progress in things? And he's going to call this, I love this term, a mental geography, right? He says, if we can go no further than this mental geography or delineation of the distinct parts and powers of the mind, it's at least a satisfaction to go that far. Now, where did this term come from? Interestingly, there is actually a background to this. One of the common things by Hume's time that had been around for probably a good 100 or so years were maps that people would make. Imagination of what the human being is actually like. And many of these were maps of the human heart, right? So in French, the pays de tendre, right? The country of affection, we could say. And so, Hume is drawing on a metaphor that might not be that familiar to us, but in his time was quite familiar to educated people with this mental geography. And he's going to talk about that there is a truth and falsehood in all the propositions on these sorts of subjects. What subject? The mind being endowed with powers and faculties. These are distinct from each other. What is distinct can be distinguished from reflection. We can say things about, for example, the will is not the same thing as the understanding, or the will does this, or here's what the imagination does, or the passions are of this number. Passions are emotions, right? We can have true and false propositions. And, very importantly, this is a truth and falsehood which is not beyond the compass, the scope of human understanding. So, human understanding is part of what's being scrutinized, but it's also the instrument, the tool, the faculty that we are using to understand itself and all of the other parts of the human being, all of this mental geography, right? So he's going to tell us that, we can make a lot of progress here. And in a footnote, a lengthy footnote, he actually tells us about the progress that's been made, in his view, in recent times by two other authors preceding Hume. So there's Francis Hutcheson, and then there is Bishop Butler. And, these are people that we don't read quite so often. Hume is viewed as a very important first-rate philosopher. We talk about him in intro to philosophy classes and textbooks, and we have seminars on him. You're probably going to have a harder time finding people who are bringing up or even know about Bishop Butler, Joseph Butler, or Francis Hutcheson. But in Hume's time, they were quite important, and Hume took them as having made some progress in moral philosophy. How so? Well, Hutcheson developed a theory of moral philosophy, of understanding what moral propositions are and what they refer to, and how, in fact, we come to judgments about things. And so here's Hume, who's talking about what Hutcheson has done. The faculty by which we discern truth and falsehood, and that which we perceive vice and virtue, had long been confounded with each other. Morality was supposed to be built on eternal and immutable relations, which to every intelligent mind were equally invariable as any proposition concerning quantity or number. So that's the previous point of view. However, a late philosopher has taught us by the most convincing arguments that morality is nothing in the abstract nature of things, but is entirely relative to the sentiment or mental taste of each particular being, in the same manner as distinctions of sweet and bitter, hot and cold arise from particular feeling of each sense or organ. Moral perceptions should not be classed with operations of the understanding, but instead with tastes or sentiments. So whether this is correct or not, and I leave that to you to decide, Hume thinks it is. And Hume thinks that some progress has been made by Hutcheson, which Hume can then pick up and develop further. What about Bishop Joseph Butler? Well, Butler is addressing another very interesting issue. Hume says, it had been usual with philosophers to divide all the passions of the mind into two classes, the selfish and benevolent, or we might say egoistic and altruistic in our own day. So selfish and benevolent are going to be opposites, contraries to each other. And he says, nor was it thought that the latter could ever attain their proper object, but at the expense of the former. So you can't have both of them at the same time. To the degree that you're selfish or egoistic, you can't be altruistic or benevolent, and vice versa. Bishop Butler says, oh no, that's actually not the case. He says, it has been proved beyond all controversy, even the passions commonly esteemed selfish carry the mind beyond self directly to the object, that through the satisfaction of those, though the satisfaction of those passions gives us enjoyment, the prospect of this enjoyment is not the cause of the passion, but the passion is antecedent to the enjoyment, and without the former, the latter could not possibly exist. And the same is the case with passions denominated benevolent. So, a man is no more interested when he seeks his own glory than when the happiness of his friend is the object of his wishes, nor is he any more disinterested when he sacrifices his ease and quiet to public good than when he labors for the gratification of avarice and ambition. And Hume is going to say, this is a considerable adjustment in the boundaries of these passions, right? So progress is getting made in moral philosophy even before Hume that he can point at and take further. So what does that further progress look like? He is going to sketch this out for us. He says, shouldn't we carry our researches further and discover, at least in some degree, the secret springs and principles by which the human mind is actuated in its operation? He talks about, the astronomers are doing this with heavenly bodies. Other people have done this with other parts of nature. Let's do this with human nature, figuring out how human beings actually do work. And so, further progress would be inquiries concerning our mental powers and, notice this term, economy. Now, what does he mean by economy there? He's not saying, well, we're going to do economic research. No. He means within the human mind, how the different powers share the household. That's the old sense of economy, managing a household. Who's in charge? Who does what? What are the roles? How do things function well? How do they break down? These are questions that we can engage in research of. And he says we can make some more progress with this. And he tells us that we want to look at the operations or principles of the mind which depend on others. So we can start tracing them back through thinking about how they work, what their arrangement is, and get to things that are more and more general in scope. And that's exactly what Hume is going to do in some of the sections of the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's what he did in his earlier book, the Treatise of Human Nature, as well. And then he tells us that there's a lot of other people that have been engaged in this. Moralists, for example. He says, moralists have been accustomed, when they considered the vast multitude and diversity of those actions that excite our approbation or dislike, to search for some common principle, so something general, on which the variety of sentiments might depend. And sometimes they've gone too far, he says, by their passion for having one general principle, but they're on the right track. And then he says something even more interesting and encompassing. You know who else has been doing this?
critics. Now, what does he mean by critics? He means people who are engaged in judgment that has some sort of reasoning to it of artistic matters or other things that we think give us pleasure, things we delight in. So you could be a wine critic, for example. Hume actually talks quite a bit about that in some of his other works. So criticism, which Hume, by the way, wrote a lot of himself, is one. Logicians. Isn't that interesting? Logicians are trying to figure this out, and we might say, I don't know any logicians who are interested in that. Well, that's because the science of logic has, kind of changed in its scope. It's become a little bit more narrow in certain respects than it used to be. And even politicians. Now, does he mean the run-of-the-mill person who's just trying to win an election? Not necessarily. He means people that are actually thinking about what's good for society and making arguments about why their policies and their administration should be in charge of the society. They're all seeking general principles, and not general principles for astronomy or things like that, general principles for how we human beings think and how we make decisions, what motivates us, right? All of these different people are doing that. So why shouldn't philosophers be contributing to that and helping out even more, right? And he's going to talk about some difficulties. So one of these, and this is towards the very end of the section, he says that though these reasonings concerning human nature seem abstract and of difficult comprehension, this affords no presumption of their falsehood. On the contrary, it seems impossible that what has hitherto escaped so many wise and profound philosophers can be obvious and easy. So it's difficult work, right? It's difficult research. But that's not a sign that anything's wrong. It's difficult topics. And then Hume suggests, and this is what he aims to do, we need to unite the two kinds of moral philosophy, the easy and popular, the abstract and rigorous, and bring them together. And he says that this is what I'm trying to do in the following inquiry. Happy if we can unite the boundaries of the different species of philosophy by reconciling profound inquiry with clearness and truth with novelty. So that is what Hume takes moral philosophy to be up to. That's its role. And he thinks that we can actually make progress, and people have before. He intends to do that in his own work, which he offers to us.